So today on the podcast, we have another set of stories that cover both Florida and California, but lean more toward the Disneyland resort. There's been a lot going on both coasts. Last week we had more of a focus on Florida, and this week, for the next 45 minutes or so, we'll focus a little bit more on California. I've gone through all 6 American parks in the last couple of weeks, and more importantly, I've been able to go on the revamped and recently reopened version of Disneyland's classic Haunted Mansion a half dozen times, and have some thoughts about the new additions there. But before we get into all that, I first need to thank another round of Bandcamp subscribers. These here are the people who keep this whole enterprise going. Thanks is going out to all of our Bandcamp subscribers, but a specific note of gratitude is going out to some new subscribers today, including the 1000th Ghost, Wed 1923, CPT Whizbang, HM Gabe, and Eric. Thanks to all of you for supporting what we do here, and now let's simply jump into the show. Today on the podcast, we continue our news stories for the month of February 2025. And as promised, we do have multiple sections today that focus on the Disneyland resort, but before we get there, we have some brief updates about Florida. Adding to the list of attraction closures out at Disney World to make room for new experiences, It's Tough to Be a Bug will formally have its last show at Animal Kingdom on March 16th. This attraction typically has a short queue, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Even during the week of Christmas, the busiest week of the year, the wait time rarely rose above 20 minutes. But ride closures tend to bring out the fans, so for the next month or so, expect to see some slightly longer lines here. The Bug Show, after performing in the tree for nearly 27 years, is now closing to make way for a Zootopia-themed animatronic show. I'm guessing that this retheme will take longer than the Country Bears took last year, as the current animatronics will need to be removed and replaced, not just recostumed and reprogrammed. Also, a lot of those in-theater effects, such as the bugs running along the seats, may need to be removed entirely, as they probably can't be tied to a Zootopia experience. With a March closure, I do think that we're on track for a late 2025 opening of Zootopia Better Zoogether, so I'd expect to see that over there right around Thanksgiving later this year. But in the intervening months ahead, it's going to be a difficult road for Animal Kingdom. It's already the least visited of the Disney parks in Florida by a lot. The park just closed Dinoland, now Tough to Be a Bug, with Epic Universe opening in May and with previews over there probably a couple months earlier. I'm guessing Disney is going to see a drop in overall attendance, with Florida tourists spending more time at the Universal parks. In this type of split vacation, in which visitors divide their time between Disney and Universal, most of them aren't going to have enough time during a week visit to visit all 4 Disney parks, as Universal presently requires a 3-day ticket, that is, 1 ticket for each of their 3 parks, for a visitor there to spend a single day in Epic Universe. This means that week-long visitors probably won't have enough time to visit all 4 of the Disney theme parks, so the Disney park that is primed to lose the most visitors is Animal Kingdom. Unless there's a surprise entertainment announcement that becomes a big draw there, expect Animal Kingdom to be somewhat empty, perhaps with shortened hours over the summer. The other park that will likely see a noticeable attendance decline is Epcot. Test Track 3.0 presently has a late summer target date for its opening, which won't do much to save attendance during the summer. Besides that, the festivals at Epcot drive attendance, and the summer, essentially from early June to late August, is the one time during the year when there's no festival and no festival booths over at Epcot. For a few years now, I have expected Epcot to develop some festival theme for part of the summer to boost attendance, but that simply hasn't happened. And hey, I'm just throwing this out there. Something like the Epcot International Music Festival would probably bring in a lot of people over the summer, perhaps even with a new version of the Disney All-American College Orchestra that used to perform for decades at the American Gardens Theater. And as a side note here, for the last few years, there has been a reunion performance of the All-American Orchestra each year, with musicians from various summers performing together. This typically happens towards the end of July at the Saratoga Springs Performance Hall on property. This performance is not an official Disney event and is not advertised widely. But assuming it happens this year, it should be fabulous. The best college musicians from a few decades ago who are now mostly professional performers. Elsewhere at the Florida resort, it's probably worth pointing out that Disney still doesn't have state buy-in on its plans for the closure of Rivers of America and the construction of the new Cars-themed area of Frontierland. The regulatory exchange between WDI and the South Florida Water Management District have gone on for months, and the language between the two, as we've pointed out, is now starting to get a little tense. I thought it was likely that there would be a resolution by late January, but that, at least as of today, Friday, February 6th, simply hasn't happened. The earliest this area might open now, I'm guessing, is 2029. But really, 2030 isn't out of the question, which further pushes back the path to Villain's Land. The three big additions that were supposed to counter Epic Universe ideally before 2030 were Tropical Americas, the Florida version of Cars Land, and Villain's Land. But two of these projects are stalled in bureaucratic red tape. If there's any upside at all here, the longer this goes on, the greater the likelihood, slim as it is, that Disney might simply decide that the cheapest and quickest path forward is to keep part of the river, as the river is connected to the canals as a stormwater mitigation system, as that presently is one of the big sticking points. But admittedly, I see preservation of a small part of the river as a minor but realistic possible outcome. All of the wrangling over the river and of the Cars project pushes back plans for Villain's Land for an opening now, I think, in the early 2030s. Assuming we don't find the world in another economic crisis, such as a minor recession or a period in which gas and fuel prices rise to the point to limit travel, which then causes Disney to cancel previously announced projects. We've all been there before. That is, until Earth movers show up, there's a lot of variables that can affect these plans, and the longer the delays go on, the greater the chance these plans might be affected. But with that now, let's jump over to one of our California-centered topics today. Let's jump into some West Coast updates. The wildfires, which we talked about on our episode last week, continue to be part of the Disney narrative in California. At the online Disney store, you can now find black and white shirts with the phrase LA Strong and an image of the mouse for sale. They sell for $30, $25 of which is donated to the Red Cross for fire relief. You can find them on the Disney store simply by typing LA Strong into the search box. Disney also announced that firefighters and other first responders to the LA wildfires, along with other support personnel, will receive 2 tickets to visit Disneyland, essentially for them and a guest, which are valid from May 5th through August 7th, Monday through Thursday. Information about these tickets will be sent in April directly to those divisions that work directly with the fire response effort, about a month before the tickets can first be used. The fires now are fully contained. though it will take years to fully clear the areas and rebuild. I think most of you know that I live in California, though over 100 miles away from Los Angeles and the fires. And this past week here, as in LA, we finally received a good bit of rain, with more on the way later this month. This will tamp down fire danger at least for a while, even if it increases the likelihood of mudslides in the burn areas. But overall, the rain is much needed here in state. Back in November, Disney submitted plans for the expansion of Avengers Campus at DCA, which includes both the new Avengers Infinity Defense Ride and the Stark Flight Test Lab. Much of this work will take place in areas that are presently backstage, as crews remove and repurpose buildings to make way for a large show building to house the Avengers Ride and to expand Avengers Campus to include the Stark Lab. Before Disney can start that backstage demo work, it first needs to remove one attraction, which is stored backstage in the general area where the new show building will go. This is the red trolley car over at DCA. These cars were added to the park back in 2012 as part of DCA's redevelopment, with stops on Buena Vista Street and in Hollywoodland. Not long after Disney submitted the expansion plans to the city for Avengers Campus, it announced that the last day of operation for the red trolley car would be Saturday, February 8th. After the trolley car attraction is closed, one of the cars will be permanently parked on the street, both for atmosphere and as a photo op location, and then, once demo permits are approved, work can begin backstage. I haven't seen these permits filter through on any of the public sites yet, but unlike the closing of the river over at the Magic Kingdom in Florida, where that man-made river is used to disperse stormwater, the permit process for DCA should be fairly straightforward, with some existing buildings coming down, the addition of temporary trailers to support construction, and then the creation of new buildings on old service roads and where storage and vehicle barns once stood. This should all begin to move forward in the next few weeks. There's also far less pressure right now out in California to move quickly. Disneyland in California does not have a new Universal Park across town staring them down. But there is the issue of the 2028 Summer Olympics. Almost surely, Disney wants new attractions in the park for that event, as there will be a lot of international free publicity on the greater Southern California area, almost surely with Olympians visiting the Disneyland Resort. In those clips and promo pieces, it would be very helpful to have some new enticing rides behind those athletes, such as a new Avengers attraction, which will help increase out-of-the-area tourism directed at the California Disney parks. I should also point out that there is no obvious movement on other attractions planned for DCA, including that Coco-themed boat ride and the Avatar Land. Also, no plans submitted for the large Disneyland Forward projects, which would convert parking areas around the Disneyland Hotel in downtown Disney into park expansion areas for Disneyland and DCA. As we've mentioned on previous episodes, the first step in the larger Disneyland Forward project is almost surely the construction of a new East Side multi-story parking garage, which will be needed to absorb the cars from the Mickey and Friends garage, as some of the parking for downtown Disney and for the hotels is likely shifted over that way. Once we start to see movement there, that will signal that Disney is moving toward larger changes at the resort. I think we are still likely years away from all of that. But there is this. Disney recently bought a 400,000 square foot warehouse on Cerritos Avenue, about 2 miles from Disneyland, more or less on the other side of the I-5 freeway from the park. Disney did not publicly announce this purchase, nor have they revealed what this warehouse space will be used for, but based on its location and size, I think it stands to reason that at least part of this building could be used to support some large projects at the Disneyland Resort, likely for the Forward project. Disney purchased these warehouse structures for $124 million, which is a sizable investment. But it gives them a large work and storage space very close to the park, which could be useful in developing those new themed areas. It could also be used as off-site storage for entertainment elements not currently in use, such as parade floats and sets for large stage shows. With both the Coco-themed boat ride and the expansion to Avengers Campus, there has been a question of where some of those entertainment elements for DCA might be placed if they were not actively needed at the park. But the big news for the California resort this past month has been the reopening of the traditional Haunted Mansion after a 6-month closure and then a presentation of the Nightmare Before Christmas version of the ride. There are some new digital effects and new projection effects mostly around the graveyard, but the center of the changes is a new version of the Bride up in the attic. The Bride in the attic space has been changed and upgraded many times. I believe we are now on the 5th distinct version of this Bride over the course of the ride's nearly 56-year lifespan. For most of the ride's history, the Bride was a Victorian figure in a traditional white gown whose transparent body revealed a beating red heart. But then, back in 2006, Disney shifted away from the Victorian theme to present Constance Hatchaway, aka the Black Widow Bride, an axe-wielding figure who presumably had beheaded 5 husbands to get their wealth. From my perspective, Constance here, both in appearance and tone, broke the Victorian feel of the mansion. Constance, with a modern haircut and makeup, felt like a contemporary figure who had been dropped down into the 19th century mansion. The axe prop held in her hands seemed like something from a 1980s slasher movie. Though I will say that the technology for this figure 19 years ago when it first premiered was pretty spectacular. For Disney, the official reason they swapped out the Bride again had more to do with the implied violence of a person who beheaded her husbands with an axe. In this version of the ride from 2006 up through 2023, up in the attic, in 5 wedding portraits one by one, the groom's head disappeared from his body in each of those images. The new Bride presentation just revealed is a mix of projection effects and practical props. Gone now is the glam makeup and the axe, leaving the Bride dressed in a flowing robe, clearly tied to a bygone century. She hovers in front of a new attic window. Also back is the red, beating heart that can be seen through her translucent body. This new figure again unifies the mansion with a Victorian presentation. In her robed hand is a physical candelabra with 3 lit candles. The interaction between the semi-see-through projection of her face and body and the solid candelabra that she's holding is pretty spectacular. And down at her feet is a one-eyed cat. This is the cat presumably that inspired the statue of the one-eyed cat with its single red eye that was placed in the queue area a few years back. According to Imagineer Kim Irvine, the new Bride gets back to the roots of the mansion story, as a forgotten woman left in the attic to mourn the tragedies of her life. The portraits of her 5 husbands are still around her, but in this new version of the ride, at least according to Kim Irvine, they haven't been decapitated. Instead, this new beating heart Bride has simply lost them, but she doesn't know why. So in the attic, as you move through in your doom buggy, you pass those 5 portraits of the bride and groom, but the men now, not just their heads, but their full bodies, fade away from the image before you find the bride hovering in front of the window, candelabra in hand. I will say, even though the portrait effect has been altered so the full body of each husband fades away, not just his head, that after seeing the previous version of the attic so many times for nearly 20 years, It was hard for me to unpair the previous storyline that these husbands had been murdered with the intended new storyline that the bride simply lost them to death until her combined grief turned her into a spirit that haunts the room overseeing those portraits. That is, the old story that was tied to these same props is so deeply set in my memory that I can't really see it from this new angle unless I consciously focus on it. If you're visiting the mansion for the first time, I suspect that this will work just fine, but maybe less so for park regulars. Also, the new bride scene overcomes some of the projection hotspots that were a problem for the Constance Hatchaway figure. The new projection effects come up from the floor and make it appear as though the see-through figure is essentially floating before you, whose porcelain-toned face is mapped with grief and longing. I do think that hiding the projectors below and having the image angled onto a thin, translucent screen might have led to an effect where the bride's face, furthest from that projector, has less definition than other parts of her body, but for me this is a minor concern. If I had one small bit of criticism here, it would be how the design of a new bride doesn't fully match the other figures in this portion of the attraction. Haunted Mansion is a ride with focused segments as opposed to one design style that unifies the experience from start to finish. The moody, endless hallway has a very different vibe and design feel than the morbidly funny graveyard. But for the most part here, in each segment there is one overall mood and one overriding design aesthetic. But here, up in the attic, just opposite the track from the bride, which is a somber Victorian figure, is the Hatbox Ghost, a figure whose form is based on the style of humorous caricature, which was a large part of early Imagineer Mark Davis's visual style. Mark Davis's visual style often included comic facial expressions and exaggerated facial features. In terms of design, the Hatbox Ghost on one side of the track has a far more exaggerated comedic appearance, like something more tied to a comic book, than does the new bride, which has a far stronger connection to what I might describe as Gothic realism with a Victorian bent. These two figures clearly come from two different designers. But some of these battles for visual unity inside the mansion go back to the original ride from 1969. To be somewhat reductive here, more of Claude Coates' emphasis on moody and mostly realistic atmospheric elements in the first half of the ride always clashed a little with Mark Davis's focus on comedic characters in the second half of the ride. That is, the mansion, unlike Pirates or It's a Small World, always felt as though multiple artists were contributing their own design emphasis to different segments along the ride's path. But now, at the end of the attic, at roughly the same place, are two different visual approaches side by side, which the mansion, until this last month, has mostly avoided. And I should point out that when Constance was initially added to the mansion, Old Hattie wasn't there yet, and there was a ways to go along the track before the doom buggies angled down into the graveyard. All that aside, I do think the new bride is a significant improvement over Constance Hatchaway. If you haven't seen an image of the new heart-beating bride, maybe think of it this way: as a type of ghostly spirit you might find on the cover of a Victorian Halloween greeting card. The candelabra in her raised hand also ties together some other elements of mansion lore. Since its opening in 1969, the endless hallway has had a floating candelabra with 3 lit candles. So if you've ever wondered which invisible spirit was carrying that object, well, this for now answers that question. It was the bride who, at least in the Disneyland version, was in that hallway in the early part of the ride before Madame Leota's seance essentially invites all the invisible spirits to become visible. Once that invitation happens, you can see both the same candelabra and the translucent bride up in the attic. Beyond this, there's one other newly placed appearance of that candelabra in a crypt out in the graveyard just before those operatic ghosts, indicating now that the bride has essentially followed you in your journey through the mansion, from the hallway to the attic to the exit of the graveyard. This final candelabra now has also replaced the unnamed phantom who once occupied this tomb. Kim Irvine commented that Disney has been exploring a plan to possibly also replace the hanging corpse of the ghost host in the cupola of the stretching room. Simply, images of a presumed suicide maybe aren't playing as well with a family audience in 2025 as they did back when the ride opened in 1969. Irvine mentioned that structural issues might have contributed to its delayed removal, but also, beyond what Kim Irvine mentioned, there's the classic narration where the ghost host, voiced by Paul Frees, talks about his own death. But of course, there's always my way, he says, and then with a lightning flash, the appearance of his gently swinging corpse. I'm under the impression that one of the biggest hurdles to get over in this is a replacement scene that doesn't mess with the classic narration that an endless line of park fans have memorized over the years. Name the last time that you were in the mansion when someone in that stretching room didn't recite the narration along with the ghost host. It's simply baked into the experience of so many fans. But a change to that scene, if it happens at all, still lays in the future. If you're in Florida, it's reasonable to assume that the new Disneyland bride and the extra candelabra are likely headed your way to the Magic Kingdom. This has been the ongoing pattern for a while. Constance, aka the Black Widow Bride, first appeared at the California Mansion in 2006. The next year she was added to the Florida Mansion. The Hatbox Ghost was first added back into the mansion in 2015, and then in 2023 it was added to the Florida Mansion. And so, though the Florida Mansion is a slightly longer ride with some different rooms, including the music room and the room I like to call the MC Escher Stairway, the recent trend here has largely been to add new effects to the California Mansion first, and then later add them to the one in Florida. So it's pretty reasonable to assume that the new bride is likely headed sometime soon to the Magic Kingdom, though of course there's no official announcement yet. And last up is Galaxy's Edge in California. Disney has posted a teaser video that suggests that Disneyland in California will soon have an actor playing the young Luke Skywalker, as well as the R2-D2 bot for a character meet-and-greet location. R2-D2 a few times has been to Galaxy's Edge before, and in the teaser video, you can see the partial face of Luke. He's young and clean-shaven, not the older, more grizzled, bearded Jedi from the sequel trilogy. But the interesting element here is this. Including the young Luke Skywalker here, now formally breaks the timeline of Galaxy's Edge. Galaxy's Edge, when it opened both in California and Florida, was set between films 8 and 9 in the Star Wars saga during the period of the First Order, with a focus on the characters of Rey, Finn, and Kylo Ren. The young Luke Skywalker is from an earlier period in the saga. In part, the consistent timeline in Galaxy's Edge was important to create a consistent, immersive environment for those role-playing on the Galactic Star Cruiser. A version of that Star Cruiser was once also considered for California, but that didn't go anywhere. Now that the Galactic Star Cruiser has been retired to office space, it seems that Disney is a little more open to abandoning the firmly fixed timeline in order to bring popular characters from other Star Wars timelines, particularly from the original trilogy, into that section of the park. And as a side note, I think there might be a pretty easy way to test how popular original trilogy characters are with fans compared to those from the sequel trilogy that presently occupy Galaxy's Edge. Simply set up a meet and greet in Galaxy's Edge with Kylo Ren and another for Darth Vader and see which one has the longer line. And I'm pretty sure I know how that test will play out. But regardless of all that, it does seem that Luke, in his black Jedi robe, is coming for a 6-week event at Disneyland called Season of the Force, which runs from March 28th to May 11th. This is likely the test balloon to see how well timeline mixing works in Galaxy's Edge, but I'm pretty sure that few visitors to the park will have any problem with it. They're just there to have a good time and to meet characters familiar to them, which for many of them involves the first trilogy. And with that, we've moved through all the major updates in terms of attractions for the California Resort and beyond, but there's more going on at the resort than just attractions. And those stories are what we're going to get into next. Now to continue our episode, which this time around has a slight West Coast focus. Downtown Disney is still going through a large renovation that is only partially complete. A number of new shops have opened, as well as a range of recent restaurants, including the Parkside Market, which is on the west side of the shopping district near the Disneyland Hotel. As with the recently opened Disneyland Hotel Villas, the Park Place Market also pulls in some mid-century design inspired by Mary Blair. And here, at least right now, I think I need to explain what exactly this means. In our ongoing series on Mary Blair, we are up to 1942, just after Mary Blair had her first big breakthrough in terms of unique color arrangements and pairings, and the stylized look of what on this series we're calling the Mary Blair children. Essentially, children that look like those in the later designed It's a Small World. These elements, the color and the figure designs, would help shape Disney animation, particularly the features in the late 1940s and the 1950s. And if you know this about the Mary Blair style, and were to look at both the Disneyland Villas Hotel and the Parkside Market, I wouldn't be surprised if you were confused as to how all this was related to Mary Blair's style. Well, here's the answer. In the mid-1950s, Mary Blair, while working for New York advertising firms, saw her style evolve, again producing what I might call a second or later key Mary Blair style. If the first style, which she continued to use through the rest of her life, was based on color pairings and the representation of figures, the second Mary Blair style was more based on lines, shapes, and limited color. In her non-Disney artistic efforts while working for advertising firms, which included campaigns for Pall Mall cigarettes, to expand her power as an illustrator, Mary studied the art of Picasso at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which was then presenting as part of Picasso's 75th birthday, a special collections exhibit. Though Mary's work never moves into cubism to find depth through fragmented images, she was influenced by Picasso's use of shapes and the strength of a line to convey a visual message. And the focus on shapes and lines and limited colors becomes more dominant in some of her work, particularly her advertising work after 1957. For fans of Disneyland, maybe think of it all this way. The interior show stages of It's a Small World feature children with their slightly larger heads arranged with expressions of wonder, joy, and curiosity to present a diorama of idealized childhood. That's the figure style that Mary Blair continued to develop in 1941 during that South American trip. But the exterior facade of It's a Small World in California is an arrangement of shapes and lines to suggest an amalgam of international architectural icons, from the Eiffel Tower to a Dutch windmill to a pagoda to St. Basil's. This reductive use of shapes to find power through simplicity is part of that later Mary Blair style, often paired with color choices that reflect a mid-century aesthetic. It is this second Mary Blair style that is evoked when Disney says the west side of downtown Disney has a Mary Blair influence, specifically bold shapes and lines, as well as a mid-century color palette largely derived from the world of advertising. So this here is the overall design aesthetic that Disney is using to visually tie together some elements of the west side portion of downtown Disney, including the marketplace, to connect with the recently opened Disneyland Villas Tower. The marketplace has a fried chicken shop, which includes sandwiches, salads, and chicken strips, a Korean restaurant, which largely serves noodles and rice bowls with a choice of protein and toppings, and a boutique cafe that serves coffee called Sip and Sonder. I've been there once, but the latte I got from Sip and Sonder in terms of flavor and texture easily beat out Starbucks down the road. Also here, a quick shout out to listener Alex for that latte. But in this segment here, I mostly want to take a look at a set of table service restaurants that have opened in recent months. It's no secret that generally I find the food at the Florida resort significantly better overall than the food at the California resort, with a few exceptions. And there are reasons for this. Disney World as a multi-day destination needs to have a wider and deeper range of food options for those looking for a mid to upscale week-long resort experience. About 20 years ago, Disney World consciously worked to rebrand itself as a foodie destination, which increased tourism and lent an air of sophistication to a Disney World vacation. I've met visitors who have stayed on property at Disney World for a month or even 3 months straight, but I've rarely talked to a person at Disneyland who is staying on property for more than a week. And to be clear, 2 to 3 nights is the most common length of an on-property vacation at the California resort. That is, some of the underlying tourism patterns and visitation fundamentals that allowed Disney World to successfully elevate its restaurants to more interesting and more expensive options aren't part of the social fabric that defines the Disneyland resort. Or to put this simply, if you're staying somewhere for a week, you probably want a few nice dining options, whereas if you're just at Disneyland for a couple of days, maybe you don't need that. But Disney is trying to move things in California in that direction. The long-term plan, of course, is tied into the Disneyland Forward efforts, which would connect up the existing resort with a new parking structure, expanded theme parks, more hotels, and a Disney Springs-like center, or perhaps even a third small theme park, over on the existing Toy Story parking lot, shifting the company's California holdings in such a way toward a week-long destination similar to that of Disney World, though of course smaller in overall acreage. But some of the early elements of that plan can be seen in the reimagining of downtown Disney, distancing some food options from those one might find in a Southern California mall. Specifically, I'm thinking of restaurants like Tortilla Joe's or the ESPN Zone, and now partnering more with regional chefs who specialize in international or unique cuisines to create dining experiences reminiscent of those at Disney Springs. Some of these recently opened offerings are fabulous, and some need a little work, especially in how they connect with the actual customer base of downtown Disney. There are 3 recently opened table service restaurants. Let's start with the true standout, what I'd easily rank as the best restaurant at Downtown Disney, with a second restaurant not really coming close. Din Tai Fung, a Taiwanese restaurant which is at the far end of Downtown Disney near the Disneyland Hotel, is in a recently constructed building. The building itself incorporates elements of Chinese architecture, and the interior, with its open-air kitchen and viewing areas, incorporates elements of a theatrical presentation into the dining experience. In my opinion, this restaurant is the true standout venue in Downtown Disney. Disney technically categorizes this as signature dining, but menu prices put this more toward the upper range of a moderate restaurant. Dishes are served family style and intended to be shared, though one drawback here, this would be a difficult restaurant to eat at solo as the shared servings are fairly large. I've been there a half dozen times now and have sampled widely on the menu. I do think there are certain dishes which are outstanding, as well as some a little less so, but I've never had anything I wouldn't recommend on their menu. So if you go there for the first time, this would be my strong recommendation for a couple dining there. One order of the pork long baos. The pork here is far more flavorful and better seasoned than the other long bao meat options. One order of the garlic green beans. For a vegetable dish, I realize the green beans are pricey, but they are fabulous. You'll need one more item to round this out. Either the fried rice or the spicy wontons would be my go-to. The shrimp and pork pot stickers are also very good. And then finish with the chocolate mochi long baos. These are only lightly sweet, like a dark hot chocolate, and make sure to order the optional salted cream to go with them. One last thing here, the reservation system for Din Tai Fung is not on the Disneyland app, as are most restaurants at the resort. Instead, it's one of the few places you need to reserve through Yelp. And reservation spots here do fill quickly. Presently, you can reserve 31 days in advance. The next set of restaurants have been developed and are overseen by Chef Carlos Gaitan. Centrico and Paseo. Centrico is the more modestly priced, casual dining offering, while Paseo is the more formal experience with entrees priced in the mid to upper range of our pricing scale. Centrico is an outdoor restaurant centered in the wide walkway of Downtown Disney with fire tables, lounge chairs, and a bar. The restaurant is located in the former location of Uva Bar. Essentially, it's a great place to people watch and enjoy the energy of the outdoor location. In terms of a Mexican restaurant, it is a significant upgrade over the recently closed Tortilla Joe's. With Centrico, the dining options at Downtown Disney continue to move toward specialized international menus, much like Disney Springs out in Florida. The menu options here, though leaning toward American taste, have a deeper sense of authenticity and a deeper flavor range than those at Tortilla Joe's. I've been to Centrico 4 times now. The menu is extensive. I have not had everything on it, but I have sampled fairly widely now. At the top of my list would be the quesabirria, which is birria-style lamb as opposed to the more often used birria-style beef, and is served inside of a folded grilled tortilla, more like a quesadilla than a taco, and is paired with a flavorful broth consommé. If I were to pick one item beyond the quesabirria, it would be the haracha de asada, which are strips of seasoned flank steak layered over corn masa with spinach leaves, black bean puree, and a goat cheese fondue. Regulars to the Florida resort long ago became used to bread service being a paid add-on. In fairness, the bread service charge has allowed many Disney World table service restaurants to create far more interesting bread offerings than simply butter and rolls. That same strategy is being applied to both Centrico and Paseo. There's a $6 charge at Centrico for fairly basic chips and salsa, which feels a little to me like a misstep. Disney World is large enough and a foodie destination so that it's able to define some of its own restaurant terms. Downtown Disney simply doesn't have the same foodie capital, at least not yet, as the Florida resort. In terms of our pricing tiers, this is a modest restaurant. Reservations here are helpful, especially on the weekend, but not necessary as they have an active walk-up line. I would place Centrico on my recommended list, particularly for the quesabirria, its offerings that lean more toward authentic Mexican flavors, and for its mid-range pricing options. The next restaurant is Paseo. Just above Centrico and some nearby shops on the second story of downtown Disney is Paseo. The atmosphere here is absolutely lovely, with both indoor and outdoor balcony dining. I've been there twice, and both times I've dined on the balcony overlooking the length of the downtown Disney shopping district. In ways, I think the atmosphere here is the strongest selling point, and I will put this up front. This is a restaurant that I keep wanting to like, largely because of the conceit of an upper-end Mexican restaurant that specializes in regional dishes with fresh ingredients appeals to me. But honestly, it's just not there yet. The first entree I ordered was the featured cochinita pibil, a pork shank marinated in pepper and pineapple vinegar, served with a black bean puree and corn tortillas. The meat was tender, more or less falling off the bone, but the combination of the meat, bean puree, marinade, and salsa didn't have the level of flavor or zest or kick that I would expect from a signature dish. It was enjoyable, but also not something I'd order again. Likewise, the queso fundito, which has a Gruyere fondue base and includes chorizo, mushrooms, and salsa, should have had a depth of flavor and spice, but again, it wasn't quite there. The madra bread served with that fondito, though, was fabulous. And on my second trip, I was still searching for a dish to recommend. The closest I came to that was the chicken enchiladas. The tortillas were perfect and had an almost fresh bread-like texture. The chicken was well prepared, and it was served with exceptionally fresh avocado and tomatoes, as well as a salsa. But overall, at an upper-end price point, I'm having trouble recommending this restaurant, as most of the dishes I've tried there, which also includes the chips and guacamole, sides of beans, chili corns, and Brussels sprouts with chorizo, as well as the Yucatan fish, never reached the level of flavor I was expecting. Again, the atmosphere here is absolutely lovely, probably the best of any downtown Disney restaurant, and the enchiladas were satisfying, easily the best of the dishes that I tried. But despite these elements, I have trouble placing Paseo on the recommended list, largely because the menu price range should bring a higher level of flavor complexities. Reservations here are helpful, but now that this restaurant has been open for a while, reservations are pretty easy to find, even for same-day dining. Reservations at Paseo are far easier to obtain than those at Centrico, which are easier to obtain than those at Din Tai Fung. Or to put this another way, I've never seen empty tables at Din Tai Fung. Occasionally I've seen empty tables at Centrico, and both times I've been to Paseo, which have been on weekends during the dinner hour, about half the tables there were empty. To be fair, this also might be related to staffing issues, but generally in this case, how crowded each restaurant is matches perfectly with my ranking of them. Din Tai Fung is superb, especially if you order the pork long baos, the garlic string beans, and the chocolate and mochi long baos with salted cream for dessert. Centrico is a very good casual dining option with interesting and authentic flavor pairings, especially if you veer away from some of those more Americanized menu offerings, such as steak tacos. And Paseo, despite its elegant location, has a number of menu items that, though not bad, never reached my expectations for an upper-end restaurant. But if you like the general direction in which downtown Disney is moving, there's more on the way, likely over the next 2 or even 3 years. In the plans are a steakhouse, a barbecue restaurant, a Cuban bakery, and a new 2-story building for the Earl of Sandwich, with a floor for table service and a floor for counter service. The table service area will be arranged as a 1960s themed British pub with an eye toward the British pop music of that era. And with that, we are now up through another update. But as always, there are news stories developing out there all the time. I'll be back next week with a new episode. The plan, at least right now, is to finish up our monthly news stories and then to move back into our story about Disney legend Mary Blair as she, in the mid-1940s, starts to work very closely with Walt Disney. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.